All right. Hello, everybody. We've got another book study. This is the final chapter, chapter 5 of Embracing Alienation. And then next week, Todd McGowan will join us, do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions and have a conversation. Um, Tonight, Karen will be doing the introduction to the chapter. Sorry, my Siri just started talking to me there. It always does that. Yes, Karen will be giving an introduction to the chapter, and then we'll open it up to discussion, conversation. This is all about really the commons and this idea of um, sharing space. So I think it'll be kind of interesting. And obviously, there's been some interesting conversations in the WhatsApp group. So I'm going to hand over to you, Karen, to do
Okay,
the introductions. And then after that, as I say, stick up your virtual hands and we'll take it from there.
great. Thank you. Um, yeah, thanks for this opportunity. Bill's not here, but if it wasn't for Bill, I probably would never do this because he gave me a little nudge. So I'm definitely not a public speaker, so I'm gonna read from some notes. I hope that's okay. And I just wanted to say that some of the information that I'm gonna be talking about, I actually sort of supplemented the chapter with a talk that Todd McGowan gave on YouTube. It's called Subjectivity and Identity. And definitely would recommend it if you're interested. It is his talk's a little bit further in when you get started. It's a part of another meeting, so just so you're aware of that. And yeah, I also just wanted to thank everybody for participating in the WhatsApp group. And I just think it's been great to see people come together in sharing ideas in this current situation and climate that we're in. I just really wanted to shout that out. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So we've arrived at Todd McGowan's closest answer to the political and how we might see it arise in embracing alienation. To see that alienation is the distance that separates people from each other and themselves is what we have in common. Todd believes the public is the space alienated subjects can meet and emancipation can break out, leading to a more egalitarian society. He discusses how the public is under threat in a capitalist society where all our relations are mediated by a commodity and we retreat further into our private worlds, worlds which can be carefully curated by us and to minimize contact with our alienated subjectivity. This confrontation with alienation is hard to bear, which is why political projects often turn away from it. It is hard to keep hold of the fact that alienation is unbearable only when we believe in the possibility of an unalienated state. In other words, alienation isn't unbearable in and of itself. He contrasts the public with how communities form and function, but also reminds us that the public and community are dialectically related to each other. The public exists through the community's failure to constitute itself. And community exists because no one can be a purely alienated subject. This idea is kind of built into McGowan's interpretation of Hegel that the problem is its own solution, or the solution to the problem is within the problem itself, or what appears to be opposed to us is actually constitutive of who we are. We seek symbolic identities in community, not only because they form our basic societal interactions, but because these identities can obfuscate our alienation and give us support for ourselves. If we go deeper into these identities, we can lose touch with our alienated subjectivity or betray the very problem that animates us. It is the way in which we invest ourselves into our symbolic identities and communities that can have deleterious effects on our status as free subjects. Our first political act can be to see the split between our alienated subjectivity and the symbolic identity we have so deeply invested in. And I'm going to share a quote here. This is from Todd. It was written to a friend of mine via email about the question of freedom and what he means by that. I know we've had some discussion about that, so I just thought I could share this here. He says, I think emancipation, for me, this is freedom, equality, solidarity is an end in itself. Freedom is to me the ultimate value. So there is no sense in asking what the good of freedom is. Freedom is the end, everything else serves. If one isn't free, one is just surviving and not existing. One is not living one's own life. What's the point of that? In emancipation, one lifts oneself out of the givens of one's life and takes responsibility for oneself. I'm not sure what else there is with a higher value. So, what can the road to freedom be? Todd suggests we pay attention to the public and where it breaks out between you and other alienated subjects. This requires that we learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We need to recognize communities form around master signifiers that require signification only by encompassing what doesn't belong to it or what it excludes from the field. So for me, the master signifier that I'm going to briefly share about in a community that I was in, it was cooperative. Another one could be you're an American. I grew up Baptist. That was a master signifier that organized my life. Communities are often founded and exist through keeping people out. If they fail to do this, they are open to everyone and cease to be communities and become the public. The public offers no way to belong. It doesn't have recourse to keeping people out. Communities have explicit rules or values members agree to, but also implicit demands that are secret from outsiders and aren't even discussed among their members. We join communities to belong and often find a demand for capitulation. We find the more we strive to belong by investing in our symbolic identities, the more we feel others belong while we are always working to belong. Todd encourages us to venture into the public where we lose our foundational supports and experience our alienation. Considering oneself a public being opens the subject to an actual universal collective. The embrace of alienation can in this way allow politics to enter the scene and found egalitarian projects. The more we believe in ourselves as self-identical in a future without alienation, the more we tie ourselves to oppressive structures. Rather than trying to cure alienation, Todd's project of emancipation sees alienation itself as freedom and the way into an egalitarian living and society. And then he also reminds us that revolutionary movements often start as a fight against the escape from alienation, but then go awry when they interrupt the affirmation of alienated subjectivity by striving for an unalienated future. So I'm just going to briefly share about my experience with this idea. So I was a founding member of a community that was oriented around non-alienation. It was oriented around the future of a food system that essentially didn't involve any sacrifice. The intentions were oriented around very ideal goals, which is to provide living wages, good work conditions for food workers, and also give them back the surplus value of their product by giving their profits directly back to them. So every part of it was oriented in things that we would all really want and desire. We came together as a community through exclusion. We had to get voted in, which meant that people got voted out. So we sort of started, our initial act was to exclude others. And then we also came together around some very strong core values, which I sort of just communicated to you, but there were some other ones too that I won't go into. And then at the very beginning, I think it was all understood that there was implicit demands that we were also organized around. And those were really kind of like under that cooperative shield master signifier. But because the goal was based on non-alienation, the actual result became that you could do anything necessary that had to be done to achieve this non-alienated goal was okay, which led to further exploitation of farm workers, entrenchment of traditional roles assigned to Latino workers as laborers, many people being hurt. My way, sort of a journey through it, was to see this very split that I was talking about in the most incredibly strong identity that that community had given me. Um, I realized I was hiding my own alienation. I actually had to become intensely self-critical to see how my own embrace of the identity I had been given was leading to betrayal, dysfunction, and damage. I had to embrace my unique way of failing, make it visible to others, make public the implicit demands that the co-op was putting on people, and eventually it did involve me leaving. So this is my political act. It was emancipatory, but remains to be seen what the outcome is. I will say it was also incredibly painful, sort of like losing a limb. But I do believe this act set me free. And I think it may even have helped the co op um, engage more with their own alienation and perhaps maybe even turn the tide a bit for them too. So, the open question that I think we all want to know, we all really are like still probably struggling to understand is what I maybe experience as something emancipatory, something very personal, can be conceived on a larger scale, aimed at symbolic structures of power and non alienated futures. And I'll stop there. Thank
Thank
you,
you
everyone.
so much. Thank you. That was excellent and very personal. That was a very beautiful way to ground this stuff. I remember you mentioned that cooperative. It was maybe a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah.
and you kind of hinted that it had been quite a difficult personal journey. So thank you.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, this is now can open up to questions, conversation. Um, you can jump in or stick your virtual hand up.
I'm not allowed to speak until after the half hour. So,
Yes, yeah, that's the rule. And I have so many things buzzing around in my mind. So, Greg, you start us off.
All right, awesome. That was great, Karen. I wanted to. There's a lot to kind of unpack in this chapter, so I guess I'll start with one piece that Karen brought up that I think is a really cool, interesting part of this chapter is that he really does drive home the point that it's not that symbolic identity or community that we should avoid it because it's bad or anything like that, but it's just because it just doesn't work, right? That like we shouldn't be under the illusion that community is going to offer some kind of salvation from alienation for us. And I just think that it's worth making sure that we kind of highlight that point that like McGowan is saying that these symbolic identities, we never really fit in them. You know, he gives a great story about like him being on the football team and in the bus, right? And how, you know, you being a part of this community, no one ever really feels like they belong in that community. All right. And that there's always this constant struggle to keep up with all of these different rituals and unwritten rules because they're trying to basically force a belonging that really isn't there. So like one of the things for me, and I'll share a quick personal thing I've been connecting with this whole time. So when I was a teenager, I was really into like punk and like the sort of underground punk movement and stuff. I mean, I had spiked hair, studded jackets, the whole thing, right? Because just in high school and even in middle school, you know what I mean, there was just didn't belong. I wasn't, popular. I really hated the way the preps and the jocks, you know what I mean, like oriented themselves around their lives and their rituals. And punk seemed like this place for people who didn't belong, all the alienated, come here, you'll belong. But what's amazing is that even within that subculture of punk, right, very, very quickly there emerges the figure of the poser, right? That, the person who's not punk enough. And if you don't use this kind of product to style your hair, you're not really punk, right? If you wear this kind of clothing or you listen to this band, it's not really punk. And it's just amazing how much that those dynamics evolve even in a group that's supposed to be about, the outcasts and the alienated. So my point is, my long-winded thing here is just to highlight this point that, the reason the public is there, and the reason why I guess we should start to try to embrace the public more, protect the public more, is because even as much as we may want to retreat into our communities and private identities, never going to work, because it can't work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it doesn't work. That's the key. It can't. If it worked, it would be amazing. If it worked, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. But the McGowan's argument is it never works. And two things were in my mind. One was just in the back of my mind, always my fear about us and what I do recreating these problems, which of course it will by definition, because community by definition creates alienation. And then I just thought about the kind of communities that I've been part of in terms of, say, as a writer and a speaker, that sometimes people come to me and they talk about, wanting to write a book or become a public speaker, and they think that there's some sort of group that I'm part of. There's a group of insiders. And that's a community that doesn't even exist. It's very weird. Whenever I talk to people who have just published something, they go like, I just published a book and nothing happened. And it's like, yep, that's basically it. Nothing happens. You're not suddenly given the secret handshake and brought into a back room, and now you're able to hang out with these people. It's like, there's maybe some of that somewhere in the world, but mostly there's some of these communities as well that are almost just projections, fantasies that we hope exist and that don't. So that was my example, or my example of not even a community that I'm part of that doesn't even exist. Oh, Levon, jump in.
Yeah, I find that interesting, what you just said as well, especially having now actually tangibly experienced somewhat of your community, which I'm hesitant to say your community, because it's really sort of a smashing of different people from all over the place with very differing ideas. But that's one of the things that I appreciated about going to Spark, was just how different everybody was. I didn't get a sense of that there was an in group or an out group, or that I wasn't dressed a certain right way, or I wasn't saying, or that I was saying the wrong things, or, you know, there's a group in my community that some of my very, very good friends are a part of, and they took over an old church, and they turned it into a theater, and they put on these incredible productions. I mean, I've seen a lot of them, and they're just talented actors and actresses, and but it was crazy because I felt like I was still at church in the 90s when I'd go, because everyone dressed a similar way, talked a similar way, and it was very dangerous. If you presented any type of right-wing idea, even remotely, it was dangerous. And my business would be at stake if I said anything. And it was interesting to sit and observe it, to see that those things can exist in opposites that way. So I love that you brought up that point, Karen, and that you shared your personal story, because I think a lot of us could maybe have similar stories that way. And then of course, yeah, the challenge becomes, how do you engage with this without becoming a community yourself? And part of it, I guess, starts with us. Like, there was part of me that really wanted to belong when I went to actually meet Peter Rollins and all these people in real life, But then I realized, no, I don't have to do anything. Just be me, and it's all good. Don't feel like you have to belong, because that's part of the problem in itself. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
And one of the points, that we've talked about and McGowan has in this in this chapter is, community is a natural thing that we all have in different ways, and we have different communities of being interested in sports or our local people who live in the area or whatever it is. We have community. It's an inherent part of life. Um, the I guess the way I read the chapter, and I think Karen, you were bringing this out, but please, you or anybody else come back to me with other things. But one of the ways I read this chapter is, not only is this his political project, it's also there's a worry. Of course, it's the worry that the commons is being eroded. Obviously, he says by capitalism, but it can be eroded in so many ways. I keep coming back to COVID because I think that there was an erosion because legitimately, but we were not rubbing shoulders with each other. We were literally not going to the park. We were literally not going to the pub. We weren't even meeting family members potentially, and I wonder to what extent over that period of time, again, there was a bit of an erosion of the commons. Um, and I know in myself that I, became more and more introverted over the last, 5 years, and I'm not rubbing shoulders as much with people who are different than I have in the past. So, um, I'm not sure what I was going to make my point, but just that the danger of, or how do we, not the dangers that we have communities, but that we become so enclosed uh, uh, that it creates, an unbearable social antagonism. Greg, jump in.
Well, the lights just went off in my house, so I don't know why that just happened. So,
Yeah.
anyway, so I guess you'll I'll fix that in a minute. You're going to talk to a dark screen.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to hijack so much of this conversation, but you really just sparked something in me when you mentioned COVID, because I had such a kind of contradictory experience with COVID. Because on the one hand, I mean, particularly living in the United States, like on the one hand, there was almost a big expansion of the public, though, because I mean, there was sort of never really before, since like the New Deal, level of like public programs and assistance, and poverty got cut in the United States, at least temporarily, in historic numbers before it was kind of eroded back to a more sort of, I don't know, I guess capital took over again, anyway, not that it ever lost its place. But what I'm saying is like, but at the same time, on a personal level, I did also experience this very much like the other became that much more unbearable to me, right? Suddenly everybody seemed like a walking germ cloud. And then we had, real political antagonism here too, right? And then there became this really like the other was so unbearable. For me, those who denied the disease and questioned the vaccines and all became kind of very unbearable. So there was this weird kind of, we're all in this together expansion of the public, coupled with this personal. I don't know. I just felt
Yeah.
the need to bring that up because I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, that's great. That you're exactly right, man. That there's a real contradictory dimension to COVID for all of those reasons. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me leaving community where I think, again, the important point is for sure not to say communities are bad and that we shouldn't try to be part of them at all. We all need communities to exist and thrive and be part of our worlds. But it's, again, Todd's point, I would say, is how you are investing yourself in it and the amount, the ways that you're investing, if it's so important that you continue to pour into that identity, even though it becomes further and further away from honoring who you actually are, or is causing, obvious harm to others. That I think that's a really clear point to pull out. But my interesting experience is that I have found that now I am much more in the public. I was very isolated at this thing because it took all of my energy and I just spent COVID. I had a job. I went to work every day. I wasn't at home, but still it was very isolating. And since I've left, I have been out in the public in so many different ways, showing up at different things, not knowing anyone, and kind of just having this space open up in myself to welcome that opportunity and to want, even though I find it incredibly uncomfortable, to even have a resource to do it. So that's been really kind of fun to see that happen.
That's very cool. You're reminding me of, you're making me miss LA, because in LA, that was my experience. I was kind of thrown into spaces like the public where people, some of my closest friends were completely different from me. And I loved it. And so yeah, just as you're talking there, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that was my highlight in the last 5 years, was when after COVID or just before, getting to rub shoulders with very different types of people. Jeff, you want to jump in?
Yes, thanks. Well, I just want to say I thought Karen did a great job, and I thought it was succinct and accurate and just really boiled it down. So thanks. Uh, and I keep coming up with things that I think are issues with the book. That's what I've done since we've been having these meetings. So I'm trying to think more about what is happening here that is working. And I keep looking for sort of a key to like understanding it in a positive way. And one of the things that occurred to me this past week was, or the last couple of weeks, was that maybe what Todd McGowan is trying to do is move past this emphasis in our current politics of thinking of community as such a positive thing. And because there are so many different communities that are now so much at each other's throats, and trying to move past a very broad understanding of identity politics, whether that's racial or gender or party based, and trying to just move past that, and base it on this sort of like foundational lack that is so broad based. And I think that's one of the things maybe he's doing in the beginning of the book when he's talking about the unconscious and the conscient subject and Hegel's notion of spirit and negation. So yeah, I just wanted to just offer that as maybe a way to understand what he's working towards here, in a positive way. At least that's how I'm doing it for myself over the last couple of weeks.
Great. I'm very interested in hearing your critiques as well, but we'll start with that. And you inspired me to think that, basically what someone like McGowan has to do, particularly, as a Lacanian, and I mentioned this in the WhatsApp group, is if you take seriously the idea that there is no other of the other, there is no meta language to ground. If there was a meta language, you could have a community. If there was a certain set of beliefs that covered everything, that would work. But if that's not the case, then communities, there'll always be foundational conflicts. There'll always be foundational differences. And then, so we have to find a political project that can deal with that reality. That's the interesting thing. But Tim, do you want to jump in?
Okay, I'll start with kind of a example that just came to me as Karen was talking a little bit. I think it's kind of weird, but then I'm going to give my theological metaphor, I suppose. But we've all heard of phantom limb syndrome. If somebody loses a limb and then later on they actually have more feeling, or perhaps they still experience the pain of that lost limb even though the limb's gone. I think that's true for me in my Christianity. It's like a lost limb that I still feel all the time. In one respect or another, everything seems to weave back into that painful lost limb that's clearly gone. Well, in the form in which I practice it, but it's like still there's so much that I compare to that. So that being said, in the course of rereading the chapter again, and then listening to some of the conversation from a theological example of leaving one space to re-enter the other space. In this regard, leaving the private, community, restricted, closed space to enter into the arena of alienation where you encounter your alienation. It isn't that it creates the alienation, it exposes it. It recognizes that we are alienated beings. And like one of the things I thought, alienated subjectivity is kind of like redundant. According to Todd, subjectivity is alienated. We don't have to add the adjective as if it's a lifestyle choice. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and be an alienated subject. Well, we just are. But my thought was, is that can we compare incarnation to God leaving the private and entering the public to encounter alienation? Just a thought that makes my phantom limb hurt.
Yes, very good. I think that's brilliant. I think that's excellent. Reminds me of Kester Bruin's reading of Christianity in Christ and the prodigal, which is we see the prodigal as a kind of failure, where the prodigal goes back to the private place of heaven, whereas Christ is one who chooses not to be the prodigal, who stays in the public and says, "Where are you, God?" And God has to leave and enter the public. But yeah.
I think it also reveals God's self-division, his own alienation, that he had to experience who he was. It wasn't that while you're in the private, you don't really, you isolate yourself or insulate yourself from it. And he shows us in many respects that God, when I say he, I don't mean it that way necessarily, but God shows that he is himself alienated. Mm-hmm. And we then experience that in Christ or in Christianity or in our lives, however we do that.
Cool. Thank you. Kate or Bill or both? Bill?
No, Kate can't talk because she's not part of the community of plaid shirt wearers, Karen.
Well, neither am I. No, it's just you two, yeah.
Yep, you're overtalked. You and
there's 4 of you, actually, yeah.
Yeah. Levon, picture 2. Pete, I'm slow. This is really an excellent chapter, and Karen's summary helps me understand maybe from 5%, now I'm up at 10%, but and it's just triggers all sorts of ideas and thinking, and especially personal experiences. So like, I'll think about Karen's experience and how that related to me or people I know. Obviously, I've been in many communities. You all have, and then just three things. Bill's attempt at being philosophical. I think community is, again, it's a single word for complex thing. I think it should not be restricted to I'm with a group of humans. A community can be, I like to read books about this framework. That's a community as well, right? So it doesn't have to be just humans sharing tea. And so it's like anything, like anything where it's not just you, yourself, and I. I mean, these days you can talk to Chat GPT, so it doesn't have to be a human, but it's just you occupy a space, position in terms of beliefs, values, whatever, and that's a community. The other thing is too about Pete. I'm slow, but I think your example of reverse evangelism really fits this because it was done pretty much in a public park, right? It wasn't done in a church, and it was definitely going against people that were not part of the community. And that, as far as I know, was a really beneficial, healthy experience. And there's ways that big businesses can do that, or you individually, but I think that's just a great example. I'm sure Todd would endorse that. So the final one is a challenge about you and Todd. How close do you think Todd got to Church of Communion of the Contradiction? I mean, I almost saw him say it in this chapter, but he didn't quite see it that way. But what do you think, and maybe we'll find out when he's on, but what do you think his comments would be on, having humans together do something about this shared alienation?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I've got a question on that myself about, because for me, the third step is, so there's the affirmation community, the negation, the commons, and the negation of negation, Church of the Contradiction, communion. And so which is a social bond based on lack. I think I understand I think I know what Todd would say. But before I say that, actually, I wanted to come back to, you reminded me of the Evangelism Project. So just to tell people very quickly what that is most of you will know, but we went to other groups, often religious groups, to be evangelized. But what we would do is the evangelism was not to hear what they thought and then become Jewish or become Muslim or anything like that, but was to see ourselves through the eyes of the other, and then being confronted with our own hypocrisies, our own in the words of this book, which I didn't use at the time, but Bill, you're right. I
Well,
think it's right.
did I mislabel it? The version I really admired was you would stand outside your own building and do a pseudo protest against the people inside.
Oh, yes, we did. That was a one-off thing we did.
Yeah.
Yes, that was that.
But
But
that's
actually,
pretty cool. Yeah. So
okay,
you get random people. You can get random people at that point. It's not, let's go talk to this group of believers and hear what they say. It
yeah.
sounds a little too structured. This was like you're basically out in public and people saying, "Oh yeah, now that you mention it, those Christians there," and you just get random feedback from a wide range of the public.
An icon.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah.
but the thing
One
that
time.
you mentioned then that I misheard, I think, but hits even better potentially. So hear this and see what you think. But in the evangelism project, the idea was that you can only see your own alienation through the eyes of the other. So your own community becomes kind of blind to it. Yeah, it has blind spots. You kind of don't see why you're an asshole because you're all in it together. And so what you need is you need the eyes of another to speak in. So we would go to the Islamic Society, for example, say, well, what do Christians look like to you? And then you would see yourself through the other's eyes, then being confronted with your own alienation and self-division within the community. So that's what I was thinking you mentioned. But the reason why I think that's an interesting one to bring up is because for me, something that, again, Todd's not talking about in this chapter. It's not that he doesn't believe it or anything, but it's like the thing with the evangelism project is I'm really interested in concretely how can you help your own community encounter its own alienation. And to use a political American example, and this is controversial, but in a way, instead of going into a debate, say a Republican and a Democrat trying to convince the other, it's almost going into a debate and going, I, as a Democrat, I'm going to look at what I look like through your eyes, see if I can therefore come to see something I'm missing, and vice versa. And then each becomes an instrument of each other's further conversion. So I think that is a concrete example of a political act that might come out of this chapter, that Bill, you kind of put me onto with that idea. And then, yeah, and then in terms of what I think, see, Todd, I think then thinks that there's temporary political movements that embody um, a type of shared negativity, and I think he would do that. But what I'm interested in is something more substantive, which it would be fun to talk to him about next week.
Yeah, he said he doesn't want to endorse a particular here today, gone tomorrow political movement, right?
Yes. Although he has
You're
occasionally, and I think that's where he goes wrong. When he's occasionally done it, I think I'm like, oh, I don't know if you should have done that. Yeah. John, jump in.
Now I'm like a caged tiger here, just
Yes.
waiting.
I'm excited. You waited for half an hour. Very good. Over half an hour. So brilliant.
I know I
There you
behaved myself
go.
nicely. Well, see, I guess I think there's something like I guess I have a little bit of a less charitable reading because it's not that I'm not disagreeing with what you guys are saying. But I think that McGowan has a different emphasis, and I think it's that subtle difference which keeps leading me into a problem um, with saying that I agree with it because, like, if you were to ask me, like, do you think that you should have this public space that you should have a space of disidentification? Like, I wouldn't be in the pyrotheology community if I didn't agree with that idea, right? So it's not the difference isn't whether there should be this space where you can experience your alienation, where you can, let's say, tap into the real, whatever kind of language you want to use to kind of express this idea. But I do think he's setting up a hierarchy here, and I think that's the problem that I keep running into because like at the very end of this chapter, it's at the very bottom of page 145 for those of you who have the physical copy, and then it continues on to the top of 146. He says there's probably a danger in completely eliminating private worlds in the name of a universal public, although this danger seems considerably lessened if we consider the public as the realm of unrelenting alienation. Then he says, we face mostly the opposite problem. But what I keep running into, and I'm trying to express this as clearly as I can, but it's a very subtle distinction, so maybe it's hard to convey properly, is that he seems to have this, and this is where I disagree with Zizek, by the way, I think, and maybe Zupanchik, because they have this ethics, it goes in the name of ethics of the real, and it's that somehow the real is almost more true and more real than the symbolic and the imaginary in Lacan. And I think that's a mistake, and I think it's almost an anti-Lacanian way of looking at these things. It's almost as if, well, if we expand this realm of alienation, if we expand this realm of the real, if we subject ourselves to this, that's in a certain sense where truth itself lies. But, and this is kind of the subtle point, is that I think the proper Lacanian position is that truth is merely in the Borromean knot between the three registers and not in any one of those registers itself. So like he's saying, like, look, maybe there's something in the private that we can't lose, but he's basically saying that we should drain as much as possible into the public as we can. And I think he's sort of like, I'm not doubting that that's a necessary moment, and like maybe we could use more public space in our kind of society. We need that space of questioning and doubt and all these sorts of things. So I'm not disagreeing with that, but there's a very nice example that Lacan uses at the beginning of Seminar 7 and the ethics of psychoanalysis, where he does Das Ding and all that stuff. And he says, people always accuse me and say that my project is trying to say that the emperor has no clothes. That's basically the position that I think McGowan's taking up. And the funny thing is he uses an example, I think it's from French literature, from a French play. He says, but what I'm actually saying is that human beings are naked underneath their clothing. That is, it's this bipolarity between, we have these symbolic identities, and those symbolic identities are important, and they ground us, and they give us structure, and they protect us from the trauma and the horror and the terror of the real, because the human drives are just this chaotic bundle that's anarchy. He even says in Seminar 7, like when I'm talking about the discourse of the master, when I'm talking about all these other traditional ethics, I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm just saying that they're partial truths. They're not the totality. And so what he's saying is that like human beings have to clothe themselves in these things, and we have imaginary fixations. We have an ego. We have a symbolic. We have create communities, and these serve very vital roles for the subject. It's just that they're not the totality of truth. And I think the problem that I have with McGowan is that he kind of has this liberal bipolarity between like, well, you're this unique, special individual who's separate from the group. And I'm not it's a subtle distinction, but I don't think it's quite Lacanian. I think it's like a small quarter turn. He's framing something incorrectly, I think.
Okay. That's I love what you're saying. I'm always struggle because I'm like, oh, I think you're articulating what I think McGowan's saying, but I also respect you enough to go, no, I think you're onto something. And I keep kind of coming back to trying to like struggle with with the subtlety of what that is. Because in some respects, McGowan would say, which I think you're right in if you're saying that, McGowan would say the truth is alienation, the truth is the real. The truth, the kind of the symbolic identities they're shifting, they're changing, the imaginary, that all shifts and changes. But what we have knowledge of is castration. What we have knowledge of is alienation. Then yes, I think that's what McGowan is saying. But I think he would also agree with you that he would go, but the symbolic and the imaginary are you can't get rid of them. But there's just an element of fantasy at the imaginary level and incompleteness at the symbolic level. But so
But
yeah.
see, but even the very light. See, I gotta play the analyst here because it's the way that we use the signifiers, right? Because it's kind of like we can't get rid of them. It's almost like we wish that we kind of can get rid of the symbolic and the imaginary, and that's the logic that governs the way that he writes in the text. And I think that's the sticking point for me. It's like Lacan is basically showing that we're trapped in this charmed circle, and all we have, I think, is this charmed circle that we're trapped in. And the point isn't to play the two, isn't to like. Maybe I could phrase it this way. I think that McGowan's running the risk of reifying the real as something almost substantial. He wouldn't phrase it that way. And he's trying because it's negativity, it's alienation, it's the disjunction. But he's almost reifying it as if we could get into a state where we can embrace that wholly, it almost functions like a wholeness and completeness for him. Whereas I don't think that's how it functions in the Lacanian framework. I think the distinction is much more subtle than that in Lacan. And I'm really glad I read that before another book right before we did this study. It's really advanced though, so I don't recommend it for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with Freud and Lacan. It's a really kind of detailed argument, but does anyone know Caleb Neal, who runs Lacan Scotland? He wrote this book called Lacanian Ethics and the Assumption of Subjectivity. He basically makes the exact same point that I'm making here in the kind of Lacanian position. So I'm not just completely alone and crazy in this. He basically takes Zizek to task. He takes Zupančič. He kind of shows that they don't really see this charm circle. The problem is that they misunderstand sort of the way that the symbolic functions in relation to the real in Lacan, and that's what I'm struggling to articulate here.
Okay, well, yeah, listen, this is where the meat is. It's also very, you get very technical, whatever, but let's keep I want you to keep hitting on that thing, and we'll figure out where it goes, and maybe with Todd as well, we'll talk about it. But Karen, jump in, either go in that direction or a different direction, whatever you want.
Yeah, no, I really I appreciate, John, what you're saying. And I think one of the things I've heard Todd say, I'm not sure that he's for the real as truth, or reifying it. I think he does honor the Lacanian tradition but I think his move is to get desire moving, to get off of the drive-based kind of stuckness and to get this desire moving again. And I think he feels like the way that happens is through an actual interaction with the unconscious and your own unconscious. And that's where he pulls in the singularity of people. And because he says that the unconscious is oriented around a loss, that actually makes freedom possible. This is what I've heard him say multiple times. So it's the site of, they're dialectically related. It's a site of how we're formed around a loss, but also makes possible ways we can be free. But I have not gotten from him that angle that you're saying. So, but I could just be totally misinterpreting him in the way I want to read it. But anyway, I don't know if that's helpful at all to you, John.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Like, it's almost like, I mean, Zizek talks about, like, there's the real and the symbolic, there's the real and the imaginary. So the real does, like, I mean, and maybe this is where the critique is, there's the real has a central place, but as a type of what what you're saying there, its central place is as a lack that permeates the symbolic and the imaginary fields. And so, yeah, but there's potentially a critique. I'm going to have to go and read that book that you mentioned as well. So I hate you for that, because now I'm going to have to get into some new technical work, but I'm already taking the note of it in my head. Does anybody else want to take us either say something about that or take us in a different direction? This is also the last chat. Well, not the last chance because we have next week with Todd, but between us all to ask questions and make comments. Greg, jump in.
Yeah, thanks. I just had something that I really wanted to ask to see what anybody else thought, because this is my second time reading this book, and I had this question the first time, and it came up again. And so Todd's vision of the public, and he gives some examples: the public park, the public bus, and so on. I can't help but be struck by, like, I'm very, like, on board with what he's saying, but it also seems to me like it's very, very urban focused, and like a lot of his examples and the way that he describes the public, I can't picture it outside of an urban setting. And I guess, I mean, we can kind of, maybe that's part of my own withdrawal of the public, but I've never lived in a city. If I'm being honest, I don't really like cities. And I guess, just even considering the latest, like, election in the United States, there's just a lot of people living in the US who are not urban folks. They live in the suburbs, they live in the countryside. How can we apply any of these kind of ideas in non-urban settings? I just didn't know if anybody thought about it in that way or has any idea, because I do think that this has to be applicable outside of urban settings to some degree, for it to be, I guess, useful. That was just a thought I had.
Well, I mean, where you live, because you say you live in a more rural environment. I mean, I always imagine it's like the pub or the bar is one of the places, but is the bar a central gathering of people in more or rural places?
To be honest, if we're going to go that route, if anything, in a lot of, I mean, I live in kind of a suburban area. I'm kind of outside of Philly. I'm in southern New Jersey. You know what I mean? So I'm not so far removed. I don't, but a lot of these more rural places, bars can be very much centers of community. They're very, like, they can be quite exclusive. Like, there's plenty of places where even down here in New Jersey, well, you can still be like, look, like, if you're black, you don't want to go to that bar. You know what I mean? So I tend to see those places as being a little bit more exclusive.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, in Ireland, there are some bars that are sectarian and some bars that are very community in the way that you're talking. But in general, the pub has functioned traditionally in Ireland as more of a commons. But yes, but even that is under threat occasionally, but yeah. As we're coming, we've got another like 10, 15 minutes. So what we'll do is I'll just kind of start to roll through everyone who's got their hands up. So if you want, stick your hand up, get in the queue. Rich, we'll go to you first.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, what I was hoping to say was kind of tied to what Greg was talking about, and a kind of a question for John as well. I was also struck by, Todd's urban examples, and it sort of made me think that if, take it sort of to its end, if everything was the public, the world would kind of be a disaster. Like, just like, community, I'm thinking about community, it sort of plays the role of keeping the world from like an apocalypse, right? Even though it's got these negative qualities, just like our clothes. I'm going back to like John's example, the humans are naked beneath their clothes. Like, just like our clothes sort of play a role of keeping us not living like animals, right? So, although I do also recognize that, like, my clothes aren't me. Like, my skin and my body is more me than my clothes. Although I do have more of a connection between, like, I see what's beneath the clothes, and the clothes I think of as sort of like, I don't know, a necessary thing, although it's not truth, right? So I do fall into like the hierarchy of the real over the imaginary and symbolic. I find myself like in that place, recognizing that the imaginary and symbolic are important, but that the real is truth. So I'm kind of also going back to John on that, just thoughts.
Yeah, you also made me think of potentially the opposite, which is as well of potentially saying that your clothes, there'd be an argument you could say maybe your clothes are more you than your skin, in that we express our subjectivity in our clothes, which makes me then come back to John. I don't know if this relates or not, but whenever Lacan says the non-dupe there is, what if, yes, there's more truth in the symbolic representations than in the real. I don't know. You just made me think of a few thoughts. I don't know how to put them all together. But Rich, do you want to say anything more on that, or?
No, I actually love, this is what I love about this group too. Is like, I'll think something and then you guys come out with something like that. And I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. But something, I was trying to also work through is, what is, who am I, beneath my clothes? Is that's kind of like what I'm always trying to find out, is like, recognize that we're putting ourselves into these communities, putting on these clothes, doing these things. But, if I just stay in that realm, then I am not free, right? I'm just doing what the symbolic is telling me to do, sort of thing, right? So yeah, it might tell me something that I don't even realize about myself, like you just did. So that was great. But yeah, I still tend to sort of put the real above the other things.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't do that.
Yeah, that's my tendency. And then as I'm listening to you, I'm going like, yeah, I can kind of get that Lacanian idea that often there's a deep truth in who we are in our symbolic representations. So yeah, John, do you want to come in on that at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the element that we sort of miss in oftentimes doing, speaking about Lacanian psychoanalysis, is that for Lacan, right, the real's a catastrophe. Well, the way that it kind of the cycle that he kind of generates is that you need because the real is a catastrophe and is chaos and anarchy, you need the imaginary to save you from the real. You need the symbolic to save you from the imaginary. And then the whole cycle kind of starts again, because no matter whichever solution you create doesn't fully work, and you need one to save you kind of from the other. But I mean, I very much like this direction that we're kind of going in with the symbolic as being kind of your true identity, because at least from my reading of Lacan, he's kind of saying that there really is nothing, like there's no being outside the symbolic. So there's kind of this void and there's this emptiness, but you can't relate it to truth because in a certain sense it's nothing. It's just the absence of something. And one of the things that always bothered me about Jung is that he treats the persona as if it's something that's not true. And this is precisely the element that I'm trying to push on all fronts and struggling to articulate, but I think we're finally wrapping ourselves around it a little bit clearer. It's like, you go out into the world and you have a different persona than when you're sitting and, eating potato chips and getting your shirt stained and everything, just kind of sitting binge watching Netflix or something, right? There's a split in our personality. But I think there's something very deep about who we are as liberal subjects in the 21st century, that we're symbolically structured to imagine that the real person is that person eating chips, getting their shirt stained, binging Netflix, and that everything else is just sort of a mask and a persona and something that you play. But the truth is that you're sort of both those people. You're sort of the private personality and the public personality, and both those things kind of live in you. This is why Zizek what I like about Jesus, he's kind of like, there really is not necessarily a distinction between you and the mask that you wear. The mask that you wear, if you were to strip away all the masks that you had, there wouldn't be a person. There'd just be an empty organism. And that's the problem that I'm running into with McGowan. I think he still thinks that the true you is the naked ape,
Mhm.
even if he wouldn't phrase it that way.
Yeah, this is interesting because yeah, I'm just realizing, although I don't know what Todd would say, but I think I'm getting it a bit more. Yeah, because the Jungian idea is yeah, beneath the persona, whatever. But Zizek talks about is yes, the persona speaks a truth. There is, and he does the beautiful example of I think it used to be called Second Life, but it's games that you can play where you're anonymous, where precisely in your mask you can express dimensions of yourself. So the idea that in the symbolic, well, I suppose it wasn't it like Freud said, if you really look at someone, you would think it was impossible for them to lie. Because they tell the truth in the tapping of their finger, whatever. But it's almost like if you look at the persona, the truth is on the surface. The truth is there, hidden in plain sight. I don't know if that's yeah, I think I'm getting closer to something here. Um, Jeff, do you want to jump in on that, or does anybody want to jump in on that before we go to Jeff? Or John, do you want to respond to that at all quickly before we go to Jeff?
I just want to say something very briefly because I don't want to take up any more time. I think that the difficult thing, and I just will just kind of frame this a little bit, is that, like when you look at the debates that go on within psychoanalysis, why these things are so difficult is because, right, like all psychoanalysts are generally, except the relationals who moved away from that now, but basically everybody's using the same vocabulary. They're talking about drive, they're talking about id, ego, superego, they're talking about libido and death drive, and we all have this common terminology, but like what makes the difference is how all of this fits together and how you position everything. So we say the real and we say the symbolic and we say the imaginary, but the precise definition of what you mean by each of these things and how they relate to each other, that's where the magic's kind of made. And so we kind of just we get caught up in all these things, and you really have to get into those weeds in order to reach some kind of, I don't want to say conclusion, but result from all of this discussion.
That's very good. I actually, as an aside, am currently really trying to wrestle with what's called the graph of desire. Some of you will know, which is a way of trying to orient all of these things in relation to each other. So there'll probably be a terrible talk coming in the future about that once I've mastered it. But I think it clicks on exactly what you're saying, John, is how they all fit together is deeply important. How they hold together, which is what I think that graph is attempting to do. Jeff,
Nobody ever masters it, so
I know,
don't
I
worry.
know. I've tried numerous times. I'm trying again. Yeah, Jeff, jump in.
Thanks. One thing I wanted to bring up that it's sort of related to, I think, what John's been saying, is that a lot of the time it doesn't feel in the text like it's dialectical enough. Like Zizek can be really good with that. I think in some of his, he's really good about, the one thing is just, struggling with the other, and it's found in the other, and as sort of working that through. And I know, Tom McGowan's aware of that. It's just not as present in the text because he really, I think, wants to foreground this universalist kind of universalism approach as opposed to a particularist approach, right? Which is the essence of the political thing for him, I think, or, a lot of what he talks about. And which is interesting because he accuses Marx of being too dualistic earlier on in the text. And I think that that's a critique that you can level at this text, at least as it's written. It can feel a little too dualistic to me, which I wanted to bring up the distinction he's making between the public and a community is isn't satisfying to me all the time, because he says, for instance, on 114, unlike the community, the public foregrounds the alienation of the subject. It's a space that no one owns and that anyone can access, even though certain interests attempt to own it and to deny access. The public is constantly under assault in capitalist society because it represents an egalitarian threat to capitalism's demand that we remain merely private beings. And he has this, the way he's talking about this throughout the book is if we're sort of individual alienated subjects when we're in the public realm somehow. And that when we're in a community, we're still alienated and more alienated, but we're in a group. And the public doesn't function that way. I can go to a park with my punk rock friends, and walk around, and I can be on a subway, and this public, and I don't want to be too sort of literal in reading the text, but I think that is a problem here, sometimes in the book, that at least I'm tripping over a little bit. And the problem between capitalist society and the sort of like public realm, the commons, isn't that necessarily it represents an egalitarian threat to capitalism's demand that we remain merely private beings. It's that, capitalism's always trying to privatize and generate a profit off. This is the problem, public schools being privatized, and, other kinds of public housing being privatized, et cetera. So I think, in sort of disposing of a certain Marxist point of view, he's almost undermining the point he's trying to make, because it doesn't, it's much more about surplus value a lot of the time, and how that gets realized in the constant need for growth. I think that's one of the issues here.
Very good. Zizek is I think the master of dialectics. So has always been so good at it. And I think you're hitting on something. That in this chapter, this is why I want to add communion to this, because I think there's an insufficiently dialectic dimension to it. So brilliant points. Also, it's great to see Courtney putting her hand up, because I was wanting to hear from you. You'll be the last person we hear from, which is good, I think, because of the interesting conversations that you're bringing up. So we'll do either Kate or Bill. It's Kate. And then Courtney, and anybody else wants to put their hand up, stick your hand up now. Kate.
Yeah, it's my turn this time. I just wanted to jump back to what you and John were talking about, and it reminded me of Baudrillard and his way of talking about the images that get presented, slowly moving away from reflecting reality to getting to a pure simulacra where it has no relationship to reality. And it's very easy to think that we are in a place where the image that we're presenting has nothing to do with ourselves. It has nothing to do with reality, but he's now saying that we're in hyper reality, where sometimes there's more truth to the image that we're presenting than there is to the actual reality underneath it. We haven't talked about him for a really long time, so I just thought I'd pop his name in there.
Yeah, very good. That you just made me think that we should actually do something on him at some point. Maybe we have in the past.
But it was during COVID, so it was a really long time ago.
Very good. And Courtney, over to you. And this will be the last thoughts with yourself. Oh, and then I'll ask Karen if you have any closing thoughts. You may not, but we'll do that. Courtney.
Yes, please, Karen, share closing thoughts, because I'm afraid I don't have anything really substantial to contribute. I really just wanted to say thank you to all of you for all of the discussion today in particular, and throughout this whole book. I'm very grateful, and I'm also very annoyed, because you're all making me think to a point where I don't have anything to say. Because so many of these concepts and ways of looking at life, the universe, and everything, the perspectives are so new to me that I can't hardly even articulate my own emotional response to them, much less any kind of analytical response to them. I
frequently in these conversations feel, yes, Kate, I just saw your text pop up. Yes, that's exactly the reference. In these conversations, and here's my alienation. I'm gonna just out myself. In these conversations, I so often, so deeply feel like a small, eager child listening in on the grown-up conversation. Not because anybody's speaking on a too high intellectual level, but just because this is not the arena that I am accustomed to speaking, conversing in. And that at the same time, I'm starving for more of it. So, and that thinking about that and articulating that right now reminds me so clearly to consider how other people might be starving for it as well, even if they don't realize that they are. I feel very, very honored to be part of this and to get to be part of it. So thank you, all of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And we're very honored. I'm very honored to have you part of this. And I particularly remember Atheism for Lent and your involvement and what you've done in terms of your writing on that. And so I see you as very key to this conversation. So it's funny you say that you feel you're listening. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you've been central to these conversations. So
well, thank you for I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen, wanted to hand over to you in case there's any closing thoughts or comments you want to make. You don't need to say anything.
Oh, I'll keep it brief. I just think that let's think about some great questions for Todd. You know, it's really awesome, Peter, that you got him to come. I think that's amazing. And you know, I think psychoanalysis and the word, all these words that we're throwing around, Lacan and Hegel and Freud and all these ideas, at their heart, it's really just a way of kind of breaking up patterns of behavior that you yourself might be contributing in and seeing, creating a distance from that so you can see it more clearly in the ways that you might be invested in communities that can actually be actually not good in any possible way in the world or for yourself, because there are communities out there like that, just as there's some that are, you know, actually functioning in a way that can be bringing things that are positive into our world. But yeah, Courtney, I think you're not the kid here listening to the grown-ups. You're just another person that's struggling through understanding how to navigate a very complex world. And psychoanalysis and the work that Peter's doing, it's a tool. It's a tool of navigating it. It's not another answer or the truth. That's just my own personal perspective. I really found it a really useful tool. And I think, Peter, that's how your work isn't maybe necessarily going to become another community, hopefully, that's going to, you know, devolve into a place that no one wants to go. Is that keep it in mind that it's not like we're trying to arrive at an answer. That maybe the question's always going to be one step ahead of us, but that's okay. And you know, we're kind of in it together.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate your contribution. And everybody, next week we will see Todd McGowan. All right. Have a great night. Bye.